On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, a new Brazilian president. How will he guide the largest Latin American country? And a debate between a Chinese military official and a U.S. security expert.
We have experienced a lot of ups and downs.
Is there any common ground? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Far-right populist and former army captain Bolsonaro was elected as the 42nd president of Brazil. Mr. Bolsonaro's victory ended the 15-year dominance of Brazil by the left-wing Workers' Party. What's going to be its implications? What kind of leadership is he? Before we start our discussion, take a look.
The election results did not bring last-minute surprises. Mr. Bolsonaro was elected as the next president of Brazil, with 55% of the votes in the second round. Throughout the second round, both candidates spent much time attacking their opponent, trying to win the vote of many Brazilians who weren't really happy with either option. The Workers' Party and much of Brazil's left wing described Bolsonaro as a fascist and made intensive use of his statements justifying the use of torture. Bolsonaro's identity politics were also heavily criticized. In return, Bolsonaro highlighted the Workers' Party's deep involvement in corruption cases and the fact that their main leader, former President Lula da Silva, is serving a 12-year prison sentence on corruption charges. Nevertheless, the right-wing camp ended up triumphant. Upon Mr. Bolsonaro's victory, U.S. President Donald Trump made a congratulatory call himself. Mr. Bolsonaro is dubbed the Tropical Trump for his Brazil above everything motto and his populist attitude. He also expressed his intention to strengthen U.S.-Brazil ties.
We will seek bilateral relations that add to the economic and technological value of Brazilian products. We will restore international respect for our dear Brazil.
In his concession speech, Fernando Haddad, the defeated candidate from the Workers' Party, said the opposition to Bolsonaro would be strong. The presidential election has left Brazil deeply fractured and polarized. It will be a big challenge for Mr. Bolsonaro to gather the political support in parliament needed to push through his projects and calm the country's political turmoil. Many analysts say to succeed, he would need to tone down the inflammatory rhetoric that worked so well in getting him elected.
On the Brazilian presidential election, we are joined in our Beijing studio Professor Jiang Shizhe, Vice President at the Chinese Association of Latin American Studies. In Washington, D.C., we are joined by Paulo Sotelo, Director of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson International Center for Scholars. In Rio de Janeiro, we have Mr. Rafael Sailes, a Latin American analyst and independent consultant. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start with Mr. Sotelo in Washington. This is certainly a very different political leader in Brazil. Is it a big surprise, though?
It's no longer a surprise because obviously we saw that coming in recent months, especially in the recent 3 months. Bolsonaro was able to identify some great apprehension and opposition and rejection in Brazilian people of corruption, of public insecurity, and using social media very effectively to go over the traditional means of communicating with voters. He was able to win the first round decisively and by a narrower margin, but also an important margin, to win the presidency. He also won. Allies of him will govern the most important states in Brazil, and I believe he will have a plurality of over about 70 members of Congress from his party in the House of Representatives.
All right, there's a lot of numbers going on there. Mr. Saliez, the question is is he really the one that's winning the election, or the Workers' Party have really been the focal point of failure or disappointment, and therefore put him into the office?
Well, there's certainly a very large extent of anti-PT sentiment in the voting community, but it's important to keep in mind that Bolsonaro did sell something, right? He might not have sold concrete proposals to be actioned on once in government, but he did sell at least values, right? And in this case, it's the first time that values actually helped gain votes in Brazil at such a large extent. He sold values. He used those values to counterput himself against the PT and therefore launch himself towards the presidency. The PT tried to do the same thing about him in the second round, where it tried to brand itself the anti-Bolsonaro camp. But since Bolsonaro has been a shadow figure in the Brazilian politics for the past 30 years and not actually up and center, it wasn't as effective as the anti-PT sentiment, since the anti-PT sentiment is backed up by large unemployment and the general mess the country has been in the past 5 years.
Right. Exactly what kind of value, sir, are you talking about that they have been trying to sell, quote unquote? Very briefly.
So, conservative values mainly, specifically religious conservative values, right? Traditional family, independence of schools
right.
from what they consider ideology, but it's really not that different from what you see of the evangelical voter base in the United States, for example.
Mr. Jiang, is the social value not necessarily as important as the economy, it seems, at this time?
Well, yes, in the past several years, the economy is quite sluggish. And as you know, in any country in the world, if the economy is bad, then the voters want to vote for a person who said that he can deal with this economic situation.
Right.
So I think Bolsonaro says something which can appeal to these kind of voters.
Well, talking about the economy, Mr. Bolsonaro has promised during his campaign time to reduce government intervention. He said this, made a commitment to reduce the numbers of ministries, extinguish and privatize many of the state-owned companies that exist today. But we all know, Mr. Saliez, there's always a big divide between the promises during the campaign and the real implementation when in office. Do you think he could be able to do what he preached?
Well,
Mr. Saliez, please.
It's going to be very... so it's going to be very difficult for him to do this. His original goal was 15 ministries. His camp is already open to the idea of 19 ministries. There are a number of taxes he wants to extinguish and concentrate into one tax only. A lot of those taxes that he wants to extinguish currently flow money to state and municipal governments. So he's going to have a real wall to punch through if he's actually going to try to push these proposals. The establishment will push back. And this is valued for something including Social Security reform, where a lot of the congressmen in Congress right now tend to represent the civil servants, and civil servants have probably the most to lose, since they're the ones that gain the most from the current Social Security program.
Yeah, but Mr. Sotelo, if you think about it, I mean, nobody is going to have the magical remedy to let the economy turn back or turn around. But what do you think, Mr. Sotelo's possibility of policies in order to make what he promised come to a certain extent true? We don't want to forget that despite of the disappointment of the Workers' Party for the public, the Workers' Party, through different administrations, did try to revive the economy but did not succeed. Will this one be very different?
The Workers' Party, in the beginning of the Lula administration, benefiting from the commodities boom, did well in the economy. The Brazilian economy grew substantially. Poverty was reduction, but not inequality. The problem is that the Workers' Party committed the mistake of trying to perpetuate itself in power. Lula chose a successor that was a old-fashioned statist, not very polished politician, and she ran the country into the deepest and the longest recession in the country's history, with 12, 13 million unemployed people. This will be the challenge of Mr. Bolsonaro. He has to revive the economy. He has to create jobs. This will be, in my view, more important in 6 months, in 1 year, than what he does in the values department, although important also. Brazilians are practical people. They want jobs. They want solutions, practical solutions for their lives. And the important thing is how Mr. Bolsonaro will fulfill his promise to somewhat open the Brazilian economy, the most closed economy among the middle-income countries. There are ways of doing this, but he has already stated that the so-called strategic companies like Petrobras, Eletrobras, Banco do Brasil will not be privatized. So it's a work in progress, and there will be a lot of discussion internally until his inauguration on January 1st and after that.
Right. Mr. Jiang, your thought about this? I mean, particularly emerging economies over the past few years have been running into economic difficulties and challenges of different sorts with different kinds. Brazil certainly is one of those. And yet the remedy, could that be long-term to come by, or actually it has really to do with the structural of the economy that we have seen in many emerging economies?
Well, I think Bolsonaro is faced with big challenges, both short-term and long-term. The short-term is to push up economic growth rate by carrying out all kinds of reforms. And for the long-term, I would say that Brazil needs to upgrade its industrial structures. It cannot rely heavily on selling commodities. Okay. Now, having said that, I want to point out one important point. So my colleague has mentioned just now that the PT party did a bad job, but I want to say that in the social field, the PT party did an excellent job by pushing forward social progress. So we cannot deny this kind of fact.
Having said that, though, what is the thing that would make Brazil's economy to come back? Both of you, in fact, the three of you have already illustrated about that. But the question really is, now nobody is having this magical remedy. Nobody knows, once the macroeconomic policies being thrown out there, what's likely to be the result. Now, there's also a complicating effect, that the trade debate going on in the world. There's also another layer of it, which is the politics. You see, geopolitics are becoming ever more apparent and important these days. So what would that mean for an economy like Brazil's? After all, it is in Latin America, it is close to the United States, and also it is one of those emerging economies, certainly have very different political outlook compared to, let's just say, the G7 countries. So out of this very complex situation, where is Brazil groping to revive its economy? That's a very interesting question, isn't it, Mr. Sotelo? Briefly.
Yes, you put exactly your finger on the point. It's a very complex situation. One first doubt is whether Mr. Bolsonaro, an untested leader, will have the capacity to form a government, to use the base that he will have in Congress to push policies that are not agreed by elements of his own political base. So, but he does not have an alternative, because he knows he has to produce, to create jobs. I think the observation that the Workers' Party did good initially on the social side by creating millions of jobs, by lifting millions from poverty is correct. The Workers' Party betrayed itself when it mismanaged the economy, and that trend was compromised.
Yes, my question has a lot to do with geopolitics, sir. If you could address that briefly before we go to the other speakers.
Well, the geopolitics, I do not agree with that. The commodities boom abated, but Brazil became, under Dilma Rousseff, more protectionist, more interventionist. Investors lost interest.
Okay.
And
instead of accusation of the previous administration, I think there's one thing that is very important to look at the current political situation. Mr. Saliez, what do you think about that? The more complexity, it seems, facing this current administration, geopolitically.
I mean, the first thing the administration has to manage is the ability to choose people to occupy political positions of leadership. It's a administration whose leader has been on the fringes of politics, so he doesn't really have access to experienced politicians, experienced managers, experienced bureaucrats that can help manage the state and leverage the powers under the Brazilian state to implement whatever policy he chooses to implement, right? If you ask me, day one, what's his major challenge is putting together a team from top to bottom that can actually navigate the Brazilian state to implement whatever policy he chooses to implement. Now, that is nothing to say of the effectiveness of these policies, whatever they may be, but it's a worrying precondition that we have to question. And Paulo, in some sense, went into this. We have to question the ability of him to be able to put together a team that can actually govern.
Okay. Well, since you both have been focusing on the team itself, we are also looking at the pictures bigger than just the team, because we are looking at the world as it's quickly evolving. It's very much believed that the outspoken admirer of President Donald Trump, the new president of Brazil, he aims to improve ties with Washington. And following Trump's nationalist agenda, he pledged to reduce Brazil's engagement with Mercosur and also South American trade bloc that could include Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay. And also the new president said he would move the Brazilian embassy in Israel to Jerusalem and shut the Palestinian embassy in Brasilia. All one after another claims coming from the candidate then, and we'll see how he will be the president. Mr. Jiang, ever-changing geopolitics, relationship between South American countries and the United States, relationship among emerging countries, Brazil, China, Russia, and some of the others. Also relationship between a resource-rich country such as Brazil and its potential with new technologies and also new trading possibilities. Mr. Jiang, a very complex picture once again.
Yes, I was also told that the new president of Brazil might quit from the Paris Climate Agreement. Well, as we know that when the PT party was in power, the international
Well, he said that, but now he revoked what he said and said he wouldn't.
Yeah. Well, so some years ago, I would say the international image of Brazil was quite high when the PT party was in power. So if now Brazil wants to quit from Mercosur or the Paris climate change agreement, all kinds of things, then I would say the international image of Brazil will be tarnished. So I hope he will think before he takes action.
Right. We see one after another, the so-called surprise election result in one country or another. What does that mean? Mr. Saliez, very briefly before we go, 20 seconds for you, sir.
I mean, I think what it means right now is that there's some extreme anguish in voting bases around the world, and Brazil is just another country showing that, right? And the inexperience of the Bolsonaro camp is going to be a supreme challenge when it tries to navigate internationally.
We've seen that in many countries, including in its close neighbor, the United States. But for now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for being with us, Mr. Sotelo, Mr. Saliez, and Professor Jiang. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Stay with us here on World Insight. Still to come on the program, a debate between a Chinese military official and a U.S. security expert. The question is there any common ground?
In this episode of Travelogue, we step back in time to a Shanghai that existed long before its skyscrapers. From puppets to crickets, this is your ticket to the town of the Seven Treasures, to an era thought long gone in Shanghai.
Join world leaders and top business executives from across the globe in Papua New Guinea. Nestled in the Pacific, witness its unforgettable cultures and landscapes. Here, we host for the very first time the APEC CEO Summit in 2018. Don't miss the opportunity of a lifetime to rub shoulders with the best in their fields and explore this beautiful and unique nation. The APEC CEO Summit.
Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. As tensions between China and the United States apparently escalate on all fronts, some worry that downward spiral is unavoidable. Earlier, I discussed the prospect of China-U.S. defense ties with two experts from both countries. They agree, though, that the two countries are going through a rough patch, but hopes remains, as they put it, as demonstrated by the recent active conversations taking place between China and U.S. top defense officials. Take a look.
According to U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis, he will receive his Chinese counterpart Wei Fenghe in Washington later this week, marking their second meeting between the two since earlier this month. Contentious issues remain in the South China Sea and Taiwan. On September 30th, a U.S. destroyer nearly collided with a Chinese warship in China's Nansha Islands. China said the American warship had ventured into Chinese waters. Last Monday, Washington sent two warships through the Taiwan Strait, which provoked opposition from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, calling the Taiwan issue the most important and sensitive part of China-U.S. relations. Despite the frictions, the top two defense officials from the U.S. and China have stressed the need for cooperation.
The U.S. will continue to pursue a constructive, results-oriented relationship with China. Cooperation, whenever possible, will be the name of the game, and competing vigorously where we must.
China is ready to work with other countries in a more open manner, to promote development through cooperation and security, to promote the building of a community with a shared future for mankind.
As the conversation between Mattis and Wei carries on this week, a hope for a more stable China-U.S. relationship is also on the horizon.
I'm glad to be joined by two panelists. Michael Swain, Senior Fellow from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome, sir. And certainly Xu Hui, Commandant from the International College of Defense Studies with National Defense University of China. Welcome as well.
Thank you.
Let me start by asking both of you, do we still have any hope between China and the United States when it comes to security and defense ties?
Sure, I think we still have hope. I don't think we should be so pessimistic. I think U.S.-China relations today are going through a very tough period, and it's not going to be momentary. But I think nonetheless, we could still maintain decent, if not entirely close defense and security ties. I think it's essential for both countries to do so, and I think there's a way to do that.
Decent, if not entirely close relationship. That's the adjective you would like to use. Commandant Xu, what about your selection?
I think when I was a child, my mom told me never give up hope. And for U.S.-China relations, I think we have experienced a lot of ups and downs. And compared with history, I think we have no reason to give up hope. And also we notice while there are some kind of confrontational rhetoric and some kind of actions, but there's still a lot of people to carry these relationships. Like Michael Schwan, he's a strong supporter for a good relationship with us. Yes, we have to be, realistic.
Okay.
And this time of changing may be a little bit different than it was in the past. Some even say it was a tipping point years ago, and now sounds like a lot of confrontation is on the way. But I think we still have a lot of room and every reason to have a good relationship. As President Xi said, we can find thousands of reasons to build a good relationship with America.
Mr. Swain, there has been a lot of debate in China over the past few months to a year about exactly how the United States is strategically looking at China. From your perspective now, what exactly is it, if you could sum it up a little bit, particularly regarding the defense and also security issues?
Well, I think the Trump administration has really departed in a significant way from the long-standing position of the United States government regarding security and defense issues with China. It has now defined China as an adversary. They talk about it as a competition, greater degree of competition, but in fact, in many ways, it's an adversarial relationship. So what does that mean? On the defense and security side, that means the United States believes that China's objective in the Far East is to push the United States out of Asia, is to strengthen its position so that it can basically dominate that region. So it's calling China a revisionist world order. I think this is a distortion of reality. I think it's an exaggeration in many ways of what China's posture is. I think there are legitimate security concerns that have to do with policies and relative power in Asia and in other places, but they don't, or they can't be solved by naming each side as an adversary.
Of course, there's a vicious cycle, Commandant Xu, as you may know. From the Chinese side, do you see any efforts to make sure that we are not really going into a vicious cycle, particularly about the security issues?
As we said, we cannot make a collapse with one hand, right? China, with the reforming and opening up policy, since then we never perceive any specific country as our enemy or even adversaries. Even today, although there's some academics thinking about in that way, but I think our government still hope that we can have a new type of major power relationships. Yes, we agree that we have differences. We even have a lot of problems, but as your Secretary of Defense, Mattis, talked with our Minister of Defense, General Wei Fenghe. He said, yes, we have differences. We have competition, but competition doesn't mean confrontation. And disputes doesn't mean adversary or enemy. We have every reason to manage this relationship for the sake of the regional security. I think our Minister of Defense give a very positive reaction to that.
Many wonder whether those descriptions both of you have just used are really matching what is going on right now. Mr. Swain, for example, China, U.S. looking at the Taiwan issue, one of the biggest and the most fundamental issue between the two countries. After all, it's in the communique.
I mean, the basic problem today in the security realm is that China's power relative to that of the United States in Asia is growing. America has enjoyed for 70 years a position of predominance in the maritime realm in East Asia. America believes that that position and the relationship with its allies has essentially ensured the peace and stability of the region. So it's acted as what used to be called an honest broker. It acted as the security guarantor for the region. China's emergence, its increased power, increased presence, its activities in various areas, South China Sea, East China Sea, has been viewed as something that is changing that old status quo. The relative power relationship is shifting. Right. The question is, how do you deal with that? I think there's going to be neither China nor the United States is going to be able to dominate the Asia region in the future. So the solution has got to be some kind of mutual understanding about our respective positions and our respective power relations in the region.
That is certainly well put. However, this is a nuance. It's a very muddy and chaotic process. Ships of America going through the areas near Taiwan, that certainly is very alerting to the Chinese side. But you also see China and the United States trying to work out some kind of standards when it comes to aviation in the military term. Right. And in order to avoid any possibility of confrontation, particularly clash point. So how do you read this mixed signal, Commandant Xu?
We have a lot of mechanisms for communicating from strategic level and tactical levels, even from ship to ship. I think that could be developed and become mature and get better knowing each other, the rule of engagement. That's the first thing, but that cannot resolve the big problem. The big problem is security concept. While the United States always say we will be second to nothing, we will be the first. And in Chinese, policies, we never said that, and we never think about that. We are going to build, the shared future for human community, for humankind. And as Michael said, in American decision-making circle, there's always some people think that China want to dominate Asia, and to the worst, push American out. I can tell you very safely and confidently to that, we don't have such a kind of policy. An American has ever played a positive role in maintaining Asia-Pacific security. For instance, in World War I, during time in the Cold War, more or less, and we accepted reality. We know your relationship with your allies developed from history. We respect that, but this kind of relationship should not be a kind of mechanism for contain China, which was perceived by Chinese people widely.
Well, Michael, obviously Commandant Xu has a lot of confidence communicating with you, but what China can do from your perspective in order to make sure that this is going to be a peaceful process during the discussions about what kind of future regionally and internationally the two countries can share?
Well, I mean, both sides need to do things, but I think China very much needs to be showing in its activities, not just in its words, that it's very interested in a stable region that is transparent in terms of policies, in terms of strategies, that is not just simply reactive from an extreme position, worst case position. It has to address some of the real concerns that the region has about how China uses its power.
Like what?
One good example is the South China Sea. There is an area, the South China Sea, where China has claims to all of the land features in that region, and it has long-standing held that position. Other countries have claims to these land features as well. So that raises concerns in the minds of a lot of people. What is China's objective in the South China Sea? Does it want to occupy all these areas? And if so, how is it going to do that? A lot of people don't have any answers to these questions.
That really addressed the core of the issue here. That is, 200 years, China has been weak. Let's just face it, security-wise, right? Being colonialized by many and going through wars, First and Second World War. And eventually there's a civil war as well, and eventually after many political campaigns, we reach where we are, reform and opening up, China gets much stronger. And therefore, there are a lot of things that China needs to figure out by itself about what it aspires to become. And this is during this process that others are also looking at China. So this is the time that China probably needs to clarify what it wants to do.
I don't think any country can clarify everything to everybody at any times. But to my understanding, generally speaking, for China's long-term intention or strategic goals, I think it's crystal clear that any other countries. We never seek hegemony. We are going for a peace and development policy. And I think in human history, there's any single superpower in history openly declared to the world that we are going to follow a peace and development path. We are going to build community of shared future for humankind, work together with others. And what we have said, as he said, not only the words, we have done that.
Right.
And see that with the development of Chinese military or the modernization, our most advanced ships have been sent now to the South China Sea to compete to take our territory back. But we sent to the Gulf of Aden, and our best equipped engineers are working as peacekeepers in Africa. And all of these operations and actions was very highly appraised by the international community. And we reached great achievements of relationship between China and ASEAN members. At the same time, we talk about the mechanisms maintain peace in this region. As you noticed, recently we have a very big joint exercises with ASEAN. I think there's a milestone development for both sides determined to maintain peace and stability for this global commons for the benefit for everybody.
Well, Commandant Xu just analyzed the China's way and the thinking. Mr. Swain, it's also important to ask the U.S. way, with a very different White House, I have to say, and a very different ambience and chemistry among the officials of this administration. People in China, I'm sure in other countries too, are concerned whether there will be unintended crisis being created along the way as a result, particularly if you see political campaigns are becoming the dominant reason behind almost everything that is taking place right now.
Well, I think the exact danger that we look at right now in the U.S.-China relationship is that the two sides are increasingly becoming more suspicious of the motives and behavior of the other. They're becoming more cynical about the nature of the relationship, and they're becoming, therefore, more defensive, more resistant to advantages that the other side might take or gains it might have, which they think is at their expense. So I think what the U.S. and China need today is they need to have a senior level dialogue that they've never had before, that involves both military and civilian people, that deals with crisis avoidance and crisis management.
But Mr. Swain, I have to remind you, while you are making that suggestion, we understand the earlier round of security and defense, security and strategic dialogue between the United States and China have been scrapped off. So it certainly shows under the current circumstances how difficult it is for something like that to happen.
It is. There's no question about it. Right now it's very difficult. Right now we have governments in place, and I must confess, I have to say that on the U.S. side, in some ways it's worse. But we have two governments in place now that are not inclined to have these kinds of dialogues because of various reasons that, in my view, are related in large part to domestic considerations. The Trump administration is a very unusual American administration. It's not a typical U.S. administration. I'm not a big fan of the Trump administration. I think it's very disorganized. I think it has no clear China strategy or clear China policy. And it's going about it on a very piecemeal basis that's not coordinated and that's driven by these very broad generalizations about China and Chinese intentions, many of which are not based on fact, or they're based on a distortion of fact.
There used to be a deficit of trust between China and the United States. That has always been one of the things that both sides trying to work hard in order to improve. However, now, as Mr. Swain put it, that deficit is becoming ever bigger as we speak. So that is the issue facing us right now.
Anyway, the perception was still there, especially as Michael said, today's American government and the administrations have a very negative perception. But yes, we know the whole world have a very negative perception against American either. So I think for communication, bridging the perception gaps and getting back to the real circumstances is of paramount importance for both countries. I think we should have more, dialogue.
Well, I think dialogue is important. Yeah. I just said so myself about crisis management. I think that's very important, but it has to be connected with actions. And those actions have to be credible. So the other side believes that each other are interested in making certain accommodations. Now that, in Washington now, that's a dirty word. You can't say China and accommodation in the same sentence. But in fact, what the United States and China have to do is they have to think hard about where the middle ground is in their relationships, and they have to start trying to address it by actions, not just words. Yes, both sides.
Both sides. This year, 40th anniversary, China's reform and opening up. Next year, 40th anniversary of the U.S.-China relations, diplomatic relations. One could see these two events are very closely linked with one another when it comes to China's development. Whether we know what we want, and how can we, by work together, be able to achieve those things that we want, that's a big question mark.
Okay, I think Michael Schun is a highly respected scholar, and you started to learn Chinese in 1974. When I was
even before the diplomatic relations was established.
Oh, well before.
He himself witnessed the full development and changing of China and the relationship between China and America, as well as the world. I think you have the credit to give a definition of the great achievement we made of our bilateral relations, and also China. I think we need to have more people like you, and also for Chinese side, I think, as Michael Schun said many times, you have to say something, but you have to do something. Actually, for the commitment and the contribution to the world peace and development, we have done tremendously and widely accepted by majority of the international community. But for the international media, major media, our government need to learn how to talk, how to communicate with them.
I agree.
All right. It's about communication, you believe, Mr. Commandant Xu, about that. Okay.
I think communication is very important, but I also think when you look back on the history of the U.S.-China relationship over the last 40 years, the two countries established relations because they had a strategic reason for doing so, and that was to deal with the Soviet Union, to oppose the Soviet Union. There was also a desire on the part of President Nixon at the time to bring China more into the international system. There was a strategic logic and an international logic to it. That strategic logic held us through many years of the relationship. The Soviet Union is gone today. China is now a much more powerful economic power. So we need to reestablish a strategic narrative that the two countries can both credibly support, and we need to establish a much stronger basis for good Sino-American economic relations. Both of those things are essential.
Well, that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.